In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to paint some daylilies and a parakeet using watercolors. Now, the materials I'm using for this illustration is going to be the Prime Art Hot Press watercolor paper, A4 size, and I'm also going to be using, this is a 300 GSM paper, and I'm also going to be using the Faber-Castell watercolors. Now, these watercolors come in tubes that I usually fill into pans, and then I use that for the painting. So you can feel free to use any watercolors that you've got and any watercolor paper that you've got, but ensure that the paper is a hot press and a smoother paper, and not a paper that has too much of texture, because a cold press paper or more textured paper is going to have more tooth, which is going to show through in the final painting. And as well as if you are using a very thin paper, you're not going to get as many layers onto the paper. So try to use a 300 GSM paper or a quite thick paper in order to do this illustration, because then you have the best results with that. So I'm starting off by just doing a sketch of my entire illustration of the bird as well as of the lilies, because remember, when you are doing any painting or drawing, try to make sure, especially when it comes to animals, try to get the proportions as correctly as you can, because it will show through in the final painting. So no matter how well you do the drawing or the painting, if the drawing initially, the sketch is not correct, it will show through in the final piece. So to avoid that, rather just, I've had paintings where I've done the painting, and then once I got done with the painting, I realized, something was skew, or the eyes were not right, or not in line, or the nose was not right. So bear that in mind when you're doing any illustration, especially with animals. Make sure that the proportions are right before you start doing your, painting or inking or coloring with color pencils, whatever medium you're using. Make sure the initial sketch is correct and the proportions are correct. Try to have the most accurate drawing you can have. That's the most important thing with any sketch. So I'm using a regular gold Faber-Castell HB graphite pencil, and I'm just sketching my entire drawing in. So I'm drawing it in. I am using references that I've combined, and I'm just creating this entire illustration. I'm drawing everything down, getting the lilies, in a correct composition. I want to have a composition that, looks good and that's gonna, really balance out on the paper. So I've created this illustration or this composition, and now once I'm done with it, I will lighten the graphite drawing with with either a normal eraser or with a kneaded eraser, just to lighten up this graphite, so I don't have any harsh graphite lines showing through in my final illustration. Now I'm going in with my first layer of paint. Now I'm keeping it light. Now with watercolors, I always would suggest you work from light to dark, because once you go too dark with watercolors, it's difficult to lift up that color. Although you can lift up watercolors. Watercolors is forgiving in the sense that you can, lift up certain areas of darker color. But if you do go down too dark, the paper will get stained with some color, and it'll be harder for you to lighten. And I think it just looks better if you start off light and then you go darker. That way you can gradually, blend in the darker areas and make it look more realistic, and layer slowly. You don't have to just, go in dark and then you realize there needs to be highlights or anything like that. If you were to have any highlights, or you want to preserve any of the white of the paper, then you could use some masking fluid, and that can preserve the white areas of the paper. Otherwise, you just can retain those areas and not paint over those areas. In this particular illustration, there's no white specifically that I've retained, so I'm just painting over everything, but I am keeping a light color as my base. So you can see I'm starting off with the lilies. I went over with all of the pink areas first with the light pink, and now I'm coming in with a slightly darker hue of pink when I'm painting it. So I wanted a darker shade of pink. So I want everything to, just be a little shade darker, but I'm letting some of that lighter colors show through, and I'm keeping and retaining some of those lighter areas. So I'm trying not to completely cover the entire flower with the darker color. Now I'm trying to keep those lighter areas, because remember, it's a layering process, and I would like some of those previous layers to show through as I'm building up the colors, and I'm building up the layers and the textures of the different elements in my painting. So I'm going in and I'm working with a round brush. This is a round brush, a number 6 round brush, This is the Faber-Castell one that comes with your set of watercolors, but you also get them sold separately in a set as well. But any round brush would work. Around 6 or 8, that would work perfectly. You don't need to have any specific brand of brush. A round brush, as long as it's a round brush and it's around the 6 or 8 number 6 or 8, around that size, it should be fine. So I'm using this brush for the entire illustration, so you do not need a whole range of brushes. Just having this brush can do a lot, and you don't need to have a, you can get fine detail with this as a brush, as well as you can get, more coverage over larger areas as well. Now you can see on the area with the daylily, on the left hand side as well as the right hand side, I'm literally lifting off some of that pigment that I put down. Now where I didn't keep the white of the paper showing through, I do want those areas to be a bit lighter, especially where we are going to paint in the stamen of the flower. So we're going to paint that in. So we want to make sure that that is light, so that we can have, the paint, you can paint over and we can be able to see the paint when we paint over. With the leaves, I'm also going in now with the lighter color leaves, and I'm doing the first layer of green, and I'm just getting all the areas covered in with paint, and I want to make sure all the, the leaves are painted in. And I'm also experimenting and seeing what looks good for blending, because when you work wet in wet with watercolors, you can get some very beautiful blends of colors, and you don't need to have them very, detailed. It can be just a very nice wash of colors, but a gradient going from one color to another. So that's what I did there. I was just testing out to see how the different greens look if I combine them, and then I'm going in with the green and painting the rest of the leaves and the stems. Now you can see I'm going in and painting them very, smoothly, but I'm just going in with the brush, and I'm using the brush to just cover those larger areas, and I'm just painting carefully so that I don't go over areas that I like. For example, the bird's tail, I'm just avoiding that area so that I can just paint it so that it covers the, the stems and the leaves, but I'm not covering over the bird or the flower petals or anything like that. Now a tip to remember is, when you are painting with watercolors, when you are, like now I'm going in with the yellow for the stamen, try to keep everything dry between layers, especially when you're going in with another layer, if you're not trying to blend colors in. Because if I were to go over with this yellow over the, the flower, the pink, when it was still wet, I'm gonna get a lot of, blending, and it'll blend into the, the flower, and I don't want that to happen. So remember, when you are painting, let the layers dry between, if you're not doing a blend into one another, let them dry completely before going in with another color over. Now at this point, I am now just painting in the branch that the bird is sitting on. I'm just painting that first layer because I want to try to get as much covered as possible, just to ensure that I don't forget certain things when I am done with the painting, and also to ensure that I know where the placement of everything is when I'm painting, so that I can just, know where to layer. So while the flower's drying, or while the leaves are drying, or now or the stamen is drying, now I'm moving on to the branch. Once that's dry, then I can go back to the stamen and I can start adding more details to that. So you can see I'm adding more details, and I'm adding a variety of different colors, some browns, some yellows, greens as well. I'm just trying to add a variety of colors to bring some interest to the flower as well. And also I'm looking at the reference, and whatever colors I see, I try to, bring that in onto my painting and have that show through. So you can see now I'm going in still with another layer of pink, and I'm going in a little darker. But in this case, I'm going in now on a dry petal or dry layer with a wet layer. So I'm not going wet in wet, I'm working wet on dry. And it's at this point that as I'm layering, I move the paint around with the brush, and I retain some of those areas for the previous layers. But at the same time, I'm, building up that texture that each layer is giving me for the petals to make them look realistic and have a bit of texture. Otherwise they're going to look very flat if I just put a full color down on the entire petal. And I'm also trying to smoothen out those edges where I'm going with the color, just so that it blends well into the rest of the petal and you're not having these harsh stop lines where I stop painting. So I want to have it all look very smooth and let it look like it, everything is real and it looks like a realistic flower, and you're not having this sudden line of paint where it stops and there's no color on the rest of the flower. So remember that you can just do that by applying the paint, and then wherever the lines were where you ended with the paint, just go in with a damp brush and just blend that into the rest of the dry areas of the flower or whatever you're painting, but in the dry areas of your previous layer. And I'm working with the same technique on the second lily, and I'm also just trying to create also the direction of the patterns on the petals. So if you are working with any illustration, try to retain the direction that you see on the different elements. Like with these little buds for the flowers, I'm also painting in some of that pink because they're a little bit of pink and green, but they bud still. So I'm just trying to keep those lines and those textures a little bit in the direction of the flowers or the buds and the way that they grow. So you're not getting just a solid color, and you're not just getting the, like for example, I'm not painting them horizontal, I'm painting them vertical or in the direction angle that they need to be, so that it gives the buds a little bit of dimension and it gives it a bit of interest as well, and it makes it look more realistic. Now when it comes to drawing something realistic, now these are not hyper realistic, but at the same time it's realistic enough to look like actually the bird and the parakeet and the daylilies. Now to get a illustration to look realistic, you need to pay attention to your values as well as your shadows and your highlights. So your light areas or your highlights need to be as light as possible, but then your shadow areas need to be as dark as possible. Having this contrast between the highlights and the shadows really helps to push the image and make it look more realistic. So just bear that in mind when you are painting, as well as the direction that your light comes from, because lighting is very important. So you need to pay attention to your reference photo, or if you're looking from life and you're painting, look at the direction that the light is hitting your subject and pay attention to that, and then incorporate that into your painting and make sure that you add the highlights where the light is hitting the subject, and then make sure your shadows are on the opposite side of that, because we want to really create that contrast of light and dark, which will make it look realistic. Now I'm going over with a darker layer for the leaves. I want all of them to be painted in darker. Now I just had the lighted layer down to mark everything where they need to be and if I'm happy with them, because at that point they are very light and I can make some of them more visually interesting and more closer, where some can stay in the background. But I decided to keep everything looking darker, but have them have some of that texture for the leaves, and also just have them all around more or less the same color, because I want this picture to be very vibrant. This painting must be vibrant. The colors must be bright. The colors must be very intense. I don't want them to be too watercolor like, so I don't want them to be very transparent and light. I want it to be a darker painting, and that's what I like about specifically the Faber-Castell watercolors. Although you get this with many watercolors, but the Faber-Castell watercolors, when you do put them down, they can be used if you put enough pigment on your brush. You can use them quite opaque, similar to gouache, but I wouldn't say exactly like gouache. They still like watercolors, but they do have a bit more pigment. Then you can go down darker and it will be less transparent than when you were to use most other or many other watercolors, or where you use less pigment. More pigment will go down darker, and less pigment will be more transparent. So just bear that in mind when you are using your watercolors. But it's good to swatch out your watercolors before you use them. That way you know their capabilities and what you can expect from them, depending on whether you add more pigment or less pigment, or whether you are blending wet in wet, or using different techniques like wet on dry, or even dry brushing. So it's important to note those when you are swatching your paints, to get a feel for your paints and understand how they work, so that when you're doing a painting or illustration, you know what to expect from your paints. I usually have a swatch for all my watercolors, my inks, my ink tens, even my color pencils. All have got swatches for me to see how the paints work before I actually use the paints. And it's also a good guide for you to look for colors when you're looking for specific colors for an illustration that you want to do, or painting or drawing. Now I'm starting with the parakeet, and you can see I added the details, the little spots and dots on the flowers, and I kept very little water and more pigment, just so that it's a strong color, as well as it must be a strong pigment and strong color to stand out against the pink of the flower, as well as it mustn't be little blotches of paint that'll smear and blend into the background. I want it to look very very sharp, and I wanted to look like little spots, so I use a lot of pigment and less water, just so that it has enough to go on, but not enough to blend out into little blobs of paint or watery paint all over the flowers. Now with the bird, I'm making sure that, with the parakeet, I'm making sure that I'm painting in all the shadow areas. Now there are white areas for the parakeet. Now remember, white is never really white. You will have some of the colors from the background that will show in your actual painting, and or in the white area, and you'll also have shadows which are grays. So just bear that in mind, and that's what I've done here. I just painted in some gray over the white areas, and then I went over let it dry a little, and then I went over with some water on my brush, just a very little bit of water on the brush, just to blend it out, to smoothen everything so it doesn't look very harsh. And once all of that dried, now I'm going in with the green, because this is a green parakeet. Now I am using a brighter green than the green of the leaves in the background, or the green leaves around the flowers, because I want the green to stand out. I don't want the parakeet to get lost in the leaves of the flowers, but at the same time I like the contrast between the pink and the green. So I'm using a different green, and I'm just getting in all those areas. I'm covering in all the different areas for the feathers, and I'm building in those layers. Now remember, when you are painting birds, there are layers to their wings, there are layers to their feathers, so you need to take that into consideration when you are painting them, as well as you need to take into consideration the lighter areas, the darker areas, the direction of the wings, the direction of the feathers, the size of the feathers, the length of the feathers, width of the feathers. All those have to be taken into consideration. Now also I'm going in with another layer for the gray for the shadow areas on the white part of the bird. And I'm also just paying attention to the shadow areas, like on the underside of the body, going to the feet. I'm making sure that area is darker, because you will have more shadow that area, and then you'll have the other areas will be lighter. So I'm paying attention to that. Also, working on the beak, working on the eye. Another very important thing to remember is, when you paint the eye, after you paint the eye color, to add a hint or a little dot of white to your eye once it's dried. That really brings the animal to life and makes them look realistic, and makes them look like they actually are looking at you. And now I'm also just adding some blue to the tail, and I'm also adding some definition to the tail as well. So remember that you also need to add some definition, some details, some line work to differentiate between the different tail or feathers, and make them stand out a bit more, and not just look like a tire, just a triangle of color. You want them to look like the individual feathers, and you want it to have that definition. Now I'm also adding a bit of white onto the tail feathers, as well as adding some darker green to the wings, just so that I can define some of those feathers and shape them out and have that color, not blending in one entire blob of color. We want it to have different a texture of the feathers. We want it to have, see, this is with the highlight. See, when you add that tiny bit of white, it will really make a difference. Now in that case, I went too dark or too big with the white, so I painted over it, let it dry, and once it's dry, I'm going to just paint in that highlight again. Now remember, with highlights, as I did there, you saw I went over it with black again, and then I'm going to add the highlight again. That's the good thing about watercolors. You can paint over certain areas and then, just redo it. So it's never ever that the painting is lost. You can always touch up a certain area and then just redo it again. So now again, you can see I softened up some of those feathers for the gray, adding a bit more sharper details to define the feathers around the face and the chest area. And I'm just defining everywhere, just adding little bits here and there, shadows and more details and definition, just so that I can have the parakeet looking realistic and having some details, adding some details to the feet and making sure that the feet are not just one solid color, adding the little lines on there, the creases. All of that is important, and that's something you'll get from studying your reference photo. You can see I added the highlight now for the eye, and that's much smaller than what I initially added, and that looks perfect, and that really brings the animal to life. So that's definitely something that I think that you need to pay attention to when you are painting and drawing. Look at your reference, study your reference, and then you can apply that to your painting and drawing. And there we have our completed painting. Thanks for watching. Till the next one. Bye.